Welcome to episode 36 of Vampire Survivors-like game in Unity. Let's expand our weapon interaction with the world. Let's introduce piercing projectiles. The projectiles which can pierce and go through multiple enemies. Let's open the throwing projectile script. In the update, we detect and apply damage to the enemies. Let's tidy up the code a little. Let's extract methods with self-descriptive names. For move, for detection, and for time to live. Good. Now, in the hit detection, we want to make it possible to hit with the projectile multiple times before it is removed. Create variable numbers of hits. In the hit detection, when you try to hit something, check if your number of hits is higher than 0. If it is, when you hit a damageable object, decrease the amount of hits. If you exhausted all the hits, quit out of the cycle and destroy the object, because we are going to be using number of hits to determine when the projectile is exhausted and needs to be removed from the scene, so remove the hit detected bool, because it's not needed anymore. Good. But right now, what's stopping projectile from hitting one object with all of its hits? Nothing. It will hit the same target over and over again. So let's track what targets we already hit. So let's introduce a list of targets we already hit. And in the hit detection, create and call a new method called checkRepeatHit. Pass the enemy we are hitting, and if we haven't hit this enemy yet, apply damage to him. We should move not no check before the check repeat hit. Good. In check repeat hit, make sure list is initiated. And we can simply check if the list of hit targets contains the enemy we're hitting right now. Good. And now we need to populate the list with targets we hit. Let's rename it into enemy hit to avoid conflict with locally created variable. And now when we hit the enemy and applying the damage to him, we add him to the list. Good. Let's test this. Set the number of hits to be 5 on the throwing knife projectiles. Then make sure your character starts with throwing knives weapon and start the game. Now our throwing knives will be able to hit multiple enemies. This is really uncomfortable to test, Let's introduce a way to simply preset enemies on the scene, to make testing of the combat much more easier and smoother experience. Remove the initial enemy spawn on the stage event. If I just select an enemy and place him on the scene, it have no sprite, because our base prefab is just that, all data, components and colliders, but no visual sprite. And we initialize the enemy through the stage events. We are telling to the enemy spawner that certain type of enemy needs to be spawned, and he populate all this data and create the sprite for our enemies. But what we want to do is to force the game to spawn certain types of enemies, and the easiest way to do this, feed the data of what we want to be spawned, so we will be able to force spawn certain enemies for testing purposes. So create a serialized field for enemy which we want to spawn, the data of this enemy. So we can tell to this enemy component who we want to spawn. Our spawn process is inside enemy's manager, where he processes the past enemy data and create the object for the enemy. What we want to do is to move this process into the enemy itself, instead of keeping it inside enemy spawner. So let's move the sprite spawn into the enemy component. And on the start, if enemy data is not null, that means we are feeding the enemy data to this enemy and we want to spawn this enemy. Initiate sprite. And set the stats. And get the player transform from our game manager. So now, if I reference the enemy data to the enemy object, it will load into the game with enemy spawned. Like this. So now you can easily fit the enemies into the environment. Good. In the projectile we have this number. This number is what is called magic number. What is this number? I know because I read my code, but it's not immediately apparent. We should avoid making those weird, undescriptive, magical numbers in our code. So let's simply extract this number into variable with descriptive name by introducing variable for attack area. So now we can set the size of the projectile, and it will be clearly readable when you read your code what variable is this, what number is it. So we can now set the size of the projectile. The bigger the number, the bigger the size of the hit area of the projectile when it's traveling on our scene. This is it for this episode. Special thank you to Stormbreaker 9000 and the Salt Hash 2 for their generous support. With best regards, see you in the next episode.